Hi, thanks for joining us. This is the AIPMM talk on disrupting enterprise software and corporate IT in 6 steps. My name is Alex Cowan. I'm the founder and CTO of an enterprise software company called Leonid Systems, and I'm also the author of a book called Starting a Tech Business. My main area of interest is the big void between all the great ideas out there about how to build better products and better companies and actual practice. Given how widely liked these ideas are, why are they so infrequently practiced? And how can you change that? That's what we're going to talk about today, specifically in the context of corporate IT. I'm assuming a few things about you, the audience. First, that you have the desire to launch new ideas and new projects. Second, I'm not assuming any particular technical knowledge on your part. And third, I'm assuming that you want to walk away from this talk with ideas that you can act on immediately and apply. These are the 4 major areas we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about old techniques that don't work very well and new techniques that you can use to replace them that work much, much better in almost every environment, especially I think in enterprise software and corporate IT. Ideation is the first thing we'll cover. Ideation is the process of pulling together the conceptual basis for your idea, whether that is a new enterprise software product or a new way of doing things in your organization, an IT project. And before you had this idea of self-love. Your idea was your baby, you stuck with it. That conviction was what good people had, and you just stuck with it till the end, bitter, sweet, whatever it was. In some ways, this is a very classical idea. Henry Ford famously said, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. And while there's some validity to this, there's very little in an enterprise software and corporate IT environment where needs are so easy to go out and assess and look for it today. The replacement for that is this idea of design thinking. And what I mean by that specifically in this context is the practice of empathy and creativity. In this little example, we have the seamstress, and seamstresses do a lot of cutting. They need very precise cutting, and they need tools that don't wear them out. Well, if you've ever picked up a pair of sewing scissors versus a pair of regular scissors, you know what a breakthrough that probably was for whoever went in, understood the seamstress, and had the idea to create such a thing. And that's really what design thinking is about. I'll give you another example. I have a mouse problem. I'll admit it. So I got in touch with somebody I knew was kind of a mouse whisperer, and I acquired a little bit of empathy for the mice so I could apply better solutions to the problem. I learned a few things. First, mice obviously have to enter the house some way, and it's very feasible to repair your structures so that they really just can't get in. 2, mice have no bladder control. They urinate as they walk along. We'll come back to that. They prefer to walk along the edges of walls. Makes them feel safer. They're quite speedy, and they prefer peanut butter over cheese. So how do we apply creative solutions to this? Well, first of all, we know they have to get in. It's very possible to check and repair your structure so that mice just can't get in and everybody gets to get left alone. Second, how do you actually figure that out? Well, you can validate where the mice have been, both outside initially and then inside the house, using a UV light, which will highlight bodily fluids. By the way, never turn on a UV light in a hotel room. You will literally lose your mind. Third, by knowing that they like to walk along walls, this tells us a lot about how to place the traps. Best way to place them is in opposing directions on the edge of the walls, so you have them coming and going, as they say. Fourth, there's these things called snappies. The regular mousetrap you go to buy in Home Depot literally looks like something out of Tom and Jerry. Snappies are much better. They only articulate 90 degrees, and rather than some finicky little mechanism, you have a platform on the snappy that will trigger the trap, which is much more effective. It's quicker, it's more effective. And finally, put in peanut butter instead of cheese. It works better. So this is an example, a little bit of a weird example, but a part of the point is to highlight all the different places where this comes into play. Fortunately, there are some ready-made tools that you can use for design thinking, because I find with my own staff at Leonid and the startups that I mentor that getting started on design thinking is the biggest barrier for anybody to go and practice it. The ideas are very intuitive. So the First starting point with design thinking, in my opinion, is personas. And this is the development of a vivid, descriptive, and yet very action-oriented description of your user or your customer, your buyer. This is an example of a bad persona. This photo is obviously stock art. It's not a photo of a real person that somebody went out and actually took. And you can see these just look like bullet points. Lastly, the last 2 points look like their responses to a questionnaire. Now, there's a little bit of a subtlety, an important subtlety, to this whole idea of go out and talk to customers. When you're trying to validate an idea with them, it's very important that you don't go ask, hey, do you like this product? Would you want something like this? There's a great story about this from when Sony released their yellow Walkman. They had a focus group and they had people in and they said, hey, what do you think about this yellow Walkman? And everybody in the focus group said, hey, it's great. I love it. It's sporty, adventurous. And then somebody had the foresight to put a pile of Walkmans on the way out. Everybody was allowed to take one. They had a black pile and a yellow pile. Everybody took the black Walkman. It's amazing, right? How did this act of mass lying to this perfectly innocent focus group moderator happen? Well, this is the issue. If you tell people, hey, would you like something like this? They're going to say yes, because people are nice. They don't want to get in an argument. They don't want to be mean. It's very important that you observe people's natural reaction to things and that you ask them questions, if you're going to ask them general questions, that are either very factual, like how many potatoes did you eat last month, or they have to do with specific feelings about specific examples and events, like how did you feel last time you went to the dentist? What was it like? If you ask them, would you like a dentist that smiles a lot? They're going to say, yeah, that sounds great. This is an example of a somewhat better persona. You can see that the photo is not stock art. It's kind of lo-fi. It was taken with a smartphone, which is perfectly adequate for this kind of thing. And you can see the description is almost like a little vignette, a story about this person. When we have our personas, we move on to problem scenarios. And this is a way of assessing what is the real problem that this persona has that we're going to solve with our hypothetical solution. And then we move on to user stories, which you may be familiar with. User stories are a great way to encapsulate what you want a given product or system to do. And they're actually very robust. They can be organized hierarchically with epic stories describing a general arc with many sub-items below it. We'll go through an example in a bit. Then you have the individual stories, and then you can layer additional detail against those stories with test cases. And the point of these stories is that A, they're extremely descriptive. They prompt you to capture intent and not just prescribe a certain arbitrary implementation. The format of a story is very specific. As a persona, I want to do a particular thing, and this is actually the most important part, especially if you're in the early stages of a project with a lot of novelty and uncertainty around it. The last clause is so that I can derive a benefit. And this is really where you're going and attaching your assumptions about why this person wants to do this thing, which is extremely important, again, at the early stages. And you may ask, well, why do we need the problem scenarios if we have user stories where we're saying all this? Well, the problem scenarios are a little more general, and they're a good way to make sure you're really focusing in on a problem that you can validate really exists with your personas. The biggest thing about design thinking is just starting, and I recommend biting off a small piece, do a small thing. Maybe you're not doing a big product design. Maybe you're just sitting down with a spreadsheet that you've made. Try thinking about the audience for it. Can they easily do what they want to do? Is it obvious to them? Are all the different actors involved in it able to get in and make the changes they want to make? Design thinking can be practiced on a very small scale as well as a very large scale. The main thing is to care about the users and to just try it, learn how to do it by practicing. The next item we have is planning. In the bad old days, we had the 5-year plan. And this, for startup, is a total non-starter if you're an enterprise software company, because if you're in a new business, there's just so many uncertainties, it's impossible to actually bear out a 5-year plan, have that kind of foresight. And even if you're in a big IT project, having a 5-year plan, even a 2-year plan, well, very few things have this level of predictability anywhere. And the alternative to this is this idea of iterative management of using the scientific method to organize a lightweight and responsive but very rigorous approach to planning. This is nice because what would happen with these big, long, overly detailed plans, and on IT projects, I think that the 5-year plan equivalent I see a lot is these elaborate Gantt charts that in Microsoft Project and whatnot that somebody spends a lot of time at the beginning doing, and there may be a certain value in that, but then they largely get kind of ignored as things move forward because they're so complicated and there's so many things changing. I've certainly seen that happen a lot. The alternative is having no plan at all, which is what happens a lot when you have an overly elaborate plan. And that's bad too, because you don't want to be just a leaf blowing around in the wind. Having no plan is just as bad as having a plan that's overly complicated and cumbersome. The great news is there was an alternative sitting there the whole time. And this alternative was good old-fashioned science. And Eric Ries did a great job of articulating this in his book, The Lean Startup. The way that we use the scientific method is we have our idea. And in our case, we ask ourselves, do I have real evidence from my buyer that this is compelling? Design thinking helps us get a start on that. Then we form our hypothesis, which we can just call assumptions. Same basic idea. What key assumptions are required to make this business or this project a success? Then we have experimental design. How are we going to prove early and cheaply that we're either right or we're wrong and we need to revise on these assumptions? And believe me, if you're in a corporate environment and you have a lot of meetings where everybody's arguing about things, this is a great way to organize your meetings. Hey, let's talk about what's a fact, a proven assumption, if you will, what's an assumption and what's an opinion. And it's a great way to kind of net things out. You run your initial experiments, and we'll get into Agile and things like this later that help us do these things in small batches. You assess, do I pivot and I need to revise this idea because I've disproven it with the experiments I did? Or do I persevere? And do I scale up, and do I go and I invest additional resources in this thing because I know I'm barking up the right tree? This is a simple table that I use for this kind of work. I use a priority, which is something that you can do it any way you want, but I like to make priority 1 things that are kind of existential. If this proves to be untrue, we're going to either scrap or substantially revise this project, product, whatever it is, business. Then you have the assumption, does this thing need proving or not? Not everything needs proving. For instance, do parents want a piece of software that allows them to better organize the distribution of allowances? Yes, that needs to be proven. And quick and easy ways to do that are put up ads online, see if people click on them. Bring them to a landing page and measure signups. That's more of a B2C type example, but there are ways to do this in the enterprise, and we'll go through that in our case study. Do parents have smartphones? Well, no, we don't need to prove that. There's data out there. It's sort of intuitively obvious. So this is a good example of it's important to lay out assumptions, even the ones that are true if they're relevant, and then decide are these need to be proven or not. The business model canvas is a great tool for laying out the elements of the business if that's something that you need to clarify and articulate in the course of your endeavor, whatever it is. And this is a great alternative to the overly elaborate, infrequently updated, infrequently read 5-year plan, business plan, whatever. We'll go through a brief example of this in our case study. Basic ideas, there's 9 major areas that you can look at the interrelationships between them. Finally, there's the planning part. You're going for a budget, or this is an enterprise software startup. You want to do, I look at these financial planning exercises as having 3 components. There's the very short term, where you want to be extremely detail oriented on expenses so you don't have to constantly obsess about running out of money or going over budget. There's the long-term part, where you want to be able to identify the major components of scaling and how the project or the business looks at scale. How many servers are we going to need as we scale up against customers, or whatever your major scalar factors are. And you want to make that very coarse but very simple and very transparent. Then there's the middle part, and this is where I see people run into a lot of trouble. And that's like, hey, what is this business going to look like in 2 years? And it seems like it's not that far away. So people put enormous amounts of work into elaborate things to try and detail this out and predict it, where actually it's kind of like I go to you and I say, hey, what's the weather going to be in your home city tomorrow? Tell me within 1 degree. And you can just look it up and you could probably make a pretty good guess that you'll probably be right about. And if I ask you, well, can you give it to me out to 3 significant digits, there's just really nothing you can do to make that answer more accurate. That's something you want to avoid on your financial planning, and that's where you want to be real careful about that middle ground. Finally, we've got organization. And before, when we have a startup situation, which is any project or product that hasn't found a product market fit yet, that's operating in an environment of uncertainty, and many IT projects that have to do with corporate realignment or new lines of business are really the same thing as a startup in this regard. There's a behavior that I call aping, which is the idea that we want to be like a big company or a big organization, so we're going to act like one. Whereas in fact, the alternative, which comes from Steve Blank's work on customer development, is this idea of a customer development team. So this idea that a small organization is not what a startup is, that it's a fundamentally different animal, is this revelation. The customer development team is it's a heterogeneous organization, people with many skill sets, but that's organized in a very homogeneous, flat way. Which is not to say that departments and processes and roles are bad. They are good, and plenty of projects and companies and departments fall apart because they don't have that. But they're not a good thing when you're trying to manage through an environment of uncertainty. All that structure just gets in the way of the very short loops and the very multidisciplinary things that you need to be able to do. So let's look at how this stuff all plays out in the old set of ideas versus the new set of ideas. This is sort of a startup-oriented view of the whole thing, but I will say that take out investors and board and substitute in management team, steering committee, or whatever, and I've observed very similar patterns in corporate IT and enterprise software projects. We'll look at the bad old way first. Our founders or our project initiators have a new idea. They have this 5-year plan that shows 10x returns, and it's impossible. You have better odds of winning the lottery. Same thing. Oh, this CRM system is going to, save the company, save us $1 bazillion a year. Whereas in fact, it is a good idea, but it's just, it's more on the margin than this radical transformation. So let's say, we get the money, people want to do the project. Businesses, enterprises, investors, they have a certain scale issue themselves, and they want to put a lot of capital to work. So you end up with maybe too many resources thrown at this thing too early in the traditional kind of way. And the problem is you're applying these big company recipes of how you did things at scale with a known project, well understood. Whereas in fact, you need a very different approach, much more hands-on, much more fluid, much less formal delineation between different roles and different types of skill sets, because everybody just needs to be sitting down, looking at the key assumptions and validating those. So you're working through this big elaborate plan, too complicated, better luck winning the lottery. When you got to go have your plan vetted, whether that's with your steering committee, your management team, whatever, there's all sorts of concocted theories and notions about how this sort of looks like the real plan, but not really, and you can kind of see where this leads. Let's look at the alternative. We get an idea for a new project. The first thing we do is lay out the key assumptions and validate all the ones that we can validate quickly and cheaply without initiating a big, huge project and spending a lot of money. Then, maybe you don't need to allocate so much money to this thing, and it opens up non-traditional ways of approaching this thing. Now, this is a big deal for startups. The cost of entry is lower a lot. It's also a big deal in corporate IT. The cloud, SaaS, the ability to not have to, buy a whole set of servers and a, huge licensing deal and a gigantic consulting project. This has enabled a lot of experimentation in corporate IT. So I would say that's sort of the corporate IT equivalent of this same sea change with startups, where the barriers to getting started have dramatically lowered, which allows for the practice of these lean startup ideas, this quicker iteration. And we take in resources that as we need them, instead of just, arbitrarily because we have to work against some big elaborate plan. Everybody's got a clear focus on acquiring this idea of validated learning, which is executing those experiments that we talked about. They either validate or invalidate our key assumptions about what it's going to take to make this project a success. Everybody's running full tilt at that. The progress is measurable. You don't have to get in a lot of these big arbitrary arguments because everybody's got a shared set of assumptions that they're driving to validate. When you've got to go do your project review, it's a lot easier to say, this is working, here's why, or this is not working, and here's why, here's what we need to do. So our last area is development, the execution of new software and or systems integration towards this project. So you've probably heard a million times how bad waterfall is in these environments of uncertainty and how wonderful Agile is. I won't go through that a whole bunch, and of course it's not universally true, but you're in a situation with a lot of uncertainty and you have all these other techniques like design thinking, lean startup, customer development that involve iterative learning. You need to pair that with a methodology in development that allows you to see how the product's progressing as you move along. I won't make the case that it's vastly more efficient or anything, but it certainly is a good way to make sure that you're barking up the right tree as you go along. One thing I think about Agile that I spend a lot of time explaining to people in my talks and other folks that I meet is that it's actually very simple. The original Agile Manifesto was only 68 words, and the basic idea was they valued individual interactions over processes and tools. They valued working software over elaborate documentation. They valued collaboration over contract negotiation, and they valued responding to change over following an arbitrary plan. And often when you hear all these things about, well, Agile says this, Agile says that, it's actually one of the specific methodologies like Scrum or XP, and those are all very good and they're useful in their own way, but like any really powerful idea, you want to make sure you understand the core of it so you don't get mired in orthodoxy that may or may not be the right thing for your particular environment. Another thing about Agile that I think is notable is it was largely designed around this idea that there's some omniscient product owner that can answer you every question that you have about how the product should work. And in these environments of uncertainty, you obviously don't have that. So you need a way to pair your user stories, your inputs to your Agile development process with assumptions. And so for the iteration that you've just finished and you have content out there, you're looking to validate assumptions with customers, with users. And in the present iteration, you're collaborating with the development team, you're answering questions about your assumptions, the design thinking inputs you've created. That's the great thing about Agile as a component of all this stuff, is that it takes personas and stories, these design thinking artifacts, as its primary input. And when things come up like, gee, I do not know if, he wants a blue button or a red button, well, you make an assumption and you take a note to yourself as a product owner to go out and validate that with your users. In the future iteration, you're taking what you learned, your validated learning from the past iteration, and you're feeding that in to the next set of items. So these were the 4 techniques we talked about as new things that'll help you be more successful in enterprise software and corporate IT. Let's do a quick recap. So let's pretend our project is a soccer game. We're dropped on the field. We don't know which end we're driving towards, who's on our team, who's on the other team. Design thinking gives you that clarity. And the creation of personas, the creation of problem scenarios, user stories, this should really be the foundation for just about everything you do. And that applies, in my opinion, whether you're in an enterprise software product company or you're in an internal IT project. The next thing is you have this idea that, well, am I going to create a play roster for my team that goes through the whole entire game? Or am I going to look at the state of play, pivoting on a few key assumptions I've made, and change things up as I go along? Well, Lean Startup gives you that tool to do that in a structured way rather than just creating an arbitrary plan and sticking to your guns. Next, customer development tells us, well, a startup, which is any project operating in an environment of uncertainty, is a fundamentally different animal. Don't bring a baseball team to a soccer match. You need a multi-skilled team that's extremely flat and fluid to operate through these short cycles, share information, get down and dirty, do this design thinking stuff, look at the users, validate assumptions. Lastly, we've got development. Do we want to kick one big Hail Mary and pray that we get the ball in the goal, or do we want to dribble down the field, react to the opposition, the state of play? This gives us a much better shot in an environment of uncertainty of getting to our goal. And I think the most important thing is understanding the interrelationships between these techniques. I get a lot of questions of, well, if I do this one thing, do I need the other thing? These things are all complementary and they all work together. Design thinking provides us direction, and these design thinking inputs into the lean startup planning cycles. Lean startup gives us this structured but very adaptive framework for looking at whether our assumptions are bearing out and whether our idea makes sense, and if not, going back and revising it. Customer development tells us a lot about how we should organize our team, and Agile gives us a way of developing working product that pairs with all this other stuff. I get a lot of questions from people in a corporate and enterprise environment of, well, this has been good, I'm going to take it and try to sell management on it. I don't know if it'll work. Well, I have some advice for these scenarios. This is the 6 tips, distinct from the 6 steps, which we'll go over in the next section. First, don't ask permission. Just start doing this stuff. You're not going to break any rules. It won't hurt anybody. Just try it out. Bite off a small piece. And do it and show it to people. We're going to go through some specific exercises later while you'll be able to develop your own design thinking artifacts, your own lean startup things. And the best way to sell this kind of stuff is to show it. Identify a beachhead. Find something that you think is particularly relevant and focus on that. And again, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could just be fixing up some crappy spreadsheet that everybody uses that just doesn't make sense. Broadcast what you're doing. So you need to if you're going to show people, that needs to be visible. So make sure that if you build a set of personas, you put it on the shared drive, the intranet, Google Docs, whatever you use. Make yourself agile. You can organize your own work around this idea of, what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? What's standing in the way of my progress? That's sort of a basic idea called the daily stand-up. And it's a great way to organize yourself or your team's work. There's a blog post on alexandercowan.com called The Daily Do, which is one example of how to do this. Lastly, focus on yourself. If you're worried about the organization, just make these things work for yourself, learn how to do them, and everything's going to work out ultimately for you. So our next item is a case study about Leonid Systems, which is an enterprise software company that works with large communications providers, companies like Verizon or France Telecom. In 2007, I left cloud telephony provider BroadSoft to pursue some new ideas about the delivery of cloud services. Specifically, things on the network side were pretty good for this customer base. BroadSoft, for example, sells an application server that allowed these providers to offer cloud telephony services, video, so forth. Data transport was good. But the IT systems and the enterprise software at these operators weren't well adapted to a lot of these new elements. So Leonid started with actually consulting, which is something that the operators would sometimes hire folks to work with them on designing these services to make them work together, process design to change the way that they're going out and selling and installing and supporting these services, and then pulling all this stuff together. And that's what we did at Leonid. And that wasn't so bad. We understood how to do that pretty well, and we created some learnings and some retained earnings that we were able to use for our development of software products later, which was a new thing and was not obvious and required a lot of learning. The first thing I did really, was fall on my face. We built a product called Prometheus, which is quite popular now. But at the time, we rolled it out to do just data analytics. It was a business intelligence application that showed operators what services their users were using. And we thought, hey, this is great. There's no other way to do this. It's very complicated. And we assumed we would be rewarded for our hard work and ingenuity. We were not. And it wasn't that our customers didn't want to know these things. It's just that it was the middle of the recession. It wasn't on their A-list. They kind of wanted us to help advise them on these things anyway. So we layered a bunch of things into Prometheus. It's a good product for us now. But on the next 3 products, we were much more stepwise about how we evaluated these opportunities with our customers and saw them through. And we were also a lot more successful as a result. So for example, we noticed that with a cloud service, the customer-facing portal kind of is the product in a lot of regards. It's the thing the customer sees and interacts with, and the various vendors on the network side offered their own portals, which were okay, but many operators had their own design program. They wanted multi-service integrated portals, and there was kind of the choice of using these out-of-the-box things, which weren't as necessarily as adaptable, and building a new portal infrastructure from scratch, which was quite expensive to do and maintain. There were tool sets out there to allow somebody with focus on this area like Leonid to build a standardized tool set and make an architecture available that allowed for customization and generally a more adaptive experience for these operators that they could provide to their customers. So on that basis, we MVP'd a product called Loki Portals, and that's become one of our most important products. We noticed that the people creating all these cloud services were doing a huge amount of laborious, repetitive things, and it was because a lot of the legacy systems were kind of slow to adapt. And on the flip side, the IT groups within these companies didn't want a big new complicated system, but the opportunity we saw was there were lightweight architectures out there that would solve these workflow problems and not complicate the IT environment. And on that basis, we've rolled out a product called Loki Provisioning, which has also been really successful for us. And finally, we do a lot of work on business process design at Leonid, and the overhaul of the business processes that many of these engagements arrived at was almost impossible to do with the existing IT systems. And the great thing was platforms like Salesforce and Sugar were just coming of age at that point, and that allowed us to build a product called Loki BPM on top of those that is a very modern approach to this type of verticalized enterprise software. We build these things as apps on top of Sugar and Salesforce, and we MVP that. It's been a great product for us as well. This is a screenshot from the Loki Portals product, one particular screen that we call the dashboard. And we solved kind of an interesting problem with this that I'll tell you about as a specific example. The issue was we took things that would take a user, let's say 6 or 7 clicks to do, and we usually cut it in half or better. So we took it to like 2 to 3 clicks. But with our customers, we learned that that still just was not good enough. The rates of participation in using these portals versus the end customer calls our operator to make a change just wasn't where we both wanted it to be and expected it to be. And the reason was, usually it was some kind of an administrator that made these changes. In a little business, it was probably the business owner. In a medium business, it was probably the office manager. And in a big company, it was the IT person. And so what we looked at was, well, can we just take things out? Usually what you do is a process of exclusion in this case, and that wasn't really possible because there were cases where bigger customers needed all these hooks and dials and whatnot. So what we did was we built a single page that we got, which we knew what these things were. We got the 80th percentile of everything that these administrators do on a single, very data-rich page, which provided jumping off points to the more detailed screens to do these extra detailed things that were kind of the roughly 20th percentile of things that, or I'm sorry, 80th plus percentile of things that these users needed to do. And we MVP'd this with customers. We went out and tested it. Worked great. Participation rates went up, and it was a win. But what it took was a stepwise process to validate it, and preceding that, a real interest and a real detailed look at who are these users and why aren't they using the portal as much as we would like. Here's another example. Receptionists and various power users at businesses, they want a very specific configuration for their phone. They also want to be able to change it without a lot of trouble. You can see here the associated Epic story. Now, let's look at a few of the sub-stories, because I think you'll find a couple of these a little bit non-obvious. This first one is, as a receptionist, I want to receive an out-of-the-box phone setup. It's created against best practices, so I don't have to set it up myself. Okay, well that is pretty obvious, but have a look at this test case. One key thing we knew was that the product managers inside the operator, who are the ones that are learning, validating, iterating, improving these out-of-the-box templates, if they had to go to IT every single time they wanted a little change, well, just not as many changes would happen, not as much learning would take place. So we knew that we wanted to make sure the templates could be created and edited in a visual environment. These are a couple other associated test cases. The next one is, as a receptionist, I want to change the buttons on my phone so they do what I want. And so the one thing here is that we want to make sure it's possible for the user to reset to the default template. It's a good test case, and that's a part of a principle in user experience called safe exploration, where the user can always go back to home base. You can see a few other example test cases here. I won't go into those in detail. This is what the product looked like when we finished it. A visual representation of a phone, very literal, click on the buttons, you can see the different options. But lots of little subtle things that went into this to make it work the way that it does today, and to make it work as well as we wanted it to and our customers wanted it to. These are end user personas that we have at Leonid, just to give you a sense of specifically what this means in at least our particular enterprise software context. So these are our customers' customers, people that use these, for instance, cloud voice services. Then we've got enterprise personas. These are direct users at our customer, people inside the enterprise. Again, just to give you a little bit of a texture of the kind of people that come into play and how we use personas. You'll notice here that, it's not, we try to cover a lot of ground here. We try to get all the different types of audiences that we've got doing these things. Planning. So how does this work at Leonid Systems? We have hypotheses for our new products, which are, hey, should we be in this business? Is this going to make sense? Is this product going to be good for our customers? Then we have theses, which are proven hypotheses. And it's important to look at these kind of as working hypotheses, because in a business environment, particularly in high tech, things change all the time. So something you validated at one point may become untrue in relatively short order, a year or two, maybe even less. And so we keep all these, we say this is our working hypothesis, our thesis, and we keep an eye on those too. So this is an example of a few of these assumptions that we attach to this visual device management, this phone on the portal project that we went through before. One, end users want a visual tool to manage their phones. Well, luckily for us, that didn't need proving. A partner of ours had already built a prototype, lots of demand for this. We knew the demand was out there, which was a huge bonus for us. And I think that we were lucky in that regard, but this is not an uncommon thing in B2B and corporate IT environments, because you have very direct contact with your users. It's relative to other things, it's relatively easy to figure out what they want in many cases. The idea of giving the end user admin more this capability of managing their phone will do more harm than good. Well, this was very important, because if the tool turned out to be complicated and it confused people and they thought that they broke their phone and they called support, well, maybe the cure was worse than the disease. Better to just have people call in. Well, we went out, we did beta testing with customers, and we validated that, but it certainly was not a foregone conclusion that this would actually make everybody better off. We all, I think, had an underlying belief that there was an implementation that we could build that would do this, but that did need to be validated. Then, kind of taking this up one level, is the overall system going to make sense for our customers? Because if they have a lot of trouble administering the infrastructure, then that's going to drive our support costs and make it not a good business for us. And we did lab testing to validate that, which allowed us to get a handle on what was important a little bit earlier on. And then we did need to do field testing at scale to have kind of a real, what we felt was a working validation of this. And then could we get a decent price point? And the other things you see here are priority twos, which means they're non-existential. So these are a few things about, how we fine-tune this, extend it, apply it in other sub areas, different types of phones, things like that. So if we loop through the lean startup thing here, we had this idea for a visual device management tool. We created the hypotheses you just saw. We did lab work, followed by commercial release in a limited fashion to experiment and vet this, and we figured those things out, made sure it was a good money-making business for us, and we ended up not having to revise. We persevered and we scaled it up. This is the business model canvas for Leonid. We have 3 customer segments. We have these value propositions: reduce time to market, reduce cost. One thing that we kind of realized was that this, our customers are very concerned about cost, but getting to market quickly is most of the time, the most important thing to them. We have channels that we sell through, which is a big part of our business. We have dedicated personal assistants to our customers. They have account managers that look after them. These are our key resources and activities. Our partners are Our channel partners are key partners. Then we also have integrators that we look after very carefully because that helps us create an extended ecosystem, have more capacity for our customers to get the work they need done to operationalize our products. And like most companies of our type, we have a fixed product development organization that is one of our big costs. And then we have more linear scaling type resources like support, consultants, things like that. Organization. Well, when we started out, we were just doing consulting. All the feasibility for these software products was done by myself. Later, I brought in development contractors to get these things built. And then we started to expand the development and the operations team, and now we've expanded management to further scale the business. But we didn't go raise a whole bunch of money. We never raised any venture capital. In fact, we did this in a stepwise fashion on a success basis. I get the question a lot, should I learn how to code if I want to do my job better as a quote-unquote non-technical person? Well, I think everybody who has the inclination should learn how to code a little bit. It's a great thing to do. It's a great intellectual exercise, if nothing else. But I think that if you want to be more effective in your job, it's these foundation concepts that we've gone over that I would first get comfortable with, because they're actually going to help you solve the kind of problems that you need to solve better than spending a few hours, even a week, learning how to write a few lines of code. Basic technical literacy, core concepts like the model view controller, the roles in a technical team, the basic ideas around modern software system architectures. These are the next things I would get, and these are things you can learn very quickly through, there's some resources on alexandercowan.com. You can Google them. There's Wikipedia pages, lots of great free resources on the web to acquire these things. You want to learn about how to collaborate in Agile, and at this point, this is when I would go and expand yourself into a technical specialty, because these foundation skill sets are important to making you effective as the business person, the entrepreneur, the owner, the project lead, and furthermore, you'll have a much better idea of exactly what you want to learn and why. You'll probably be more motivated to learn it and learn it quicker if you have these foundation concepts. So that's my advice on the organizational aspect of making yourself a more effective contributor in a corporate IT or an enterprise software environment. Finally, development oriented. We have kind of we do Agile, and we do it in 6-week cycles. We have these different products we do a little coordination between. That's one angle on the whole thing that we manage. And then we do have a bedrock of predictive committed content, keeping up with the different subsystems and so forth, and large implementations that are going to span multiple cycles. So we do have that stuff, but we look to minimize it and explain to our customers that what they mostly really want from us is adaptability, the ability to respond to change. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I'd leave you with a set of resources you could immediately start using. If you go to alexandercowan.com/resources, you'll find this diagram and a series of resources organized across the customer development framework, which you see horizontally, and the build, measure, learn loop, which is a lean startup item. I'm not going to go through all these, but I will show them to you. Let's just talk about customer discovery. You start out with your idea. A positioning statement is a good place to start, even if this project is internal. Then you lay out your pivotal assumptions. And there is a template that we're going to go through that has some examples of and places to put these things. Then, depending on whether you're going out and you're learning about these personas, these problem scenarios from scratch, or whether you know them well, you start with either field discovery, which is when you're just really going out and learning about this persona, or you go out and you're really doing a validation exercise in the field with a market persona or personas that you already understand. And that's the third step. Then you create your user stories. Now you're driving towards an implementation. You define your minimum viable product, and this is the minimum product definition that will allow you to start proving out your pivotal assumptions. And then you drive towards customer validation, which we won't go through now, but let me show you an example of where these resources sit. This is the alexandercowan.com/resources page. You can see all these items are linked to various other parts of the site with this information. And if you follow these items like customer discovery down below, you'll see detailed more detailed flowcharts of these various items. And for instance, if we link here to the design thinking page, there's a link to the template I mentioned. And the template itself is a Google Doc, which has example user stories, problem scenarios, and assumptions and so forth. And it actually has an example from the book, a company called Enable Quiz. And this is a good starting point you can use to see what this stuff looks like and start synthesizing it for yourself. If you're looking for a B2C or non-tech example, check out alexandercowan.com/speaking. My Twitter is @CowanSF. This is my blog. We went over resources, and please feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to get in touch.